fascinating. Find out whether they've had a fight or had intercourse just before the interview. They're going to meet you at 9 o'clock in the morning and they have intercourse the night before, or they have a fight the night before, or they have a fight at breakfast. It's almost routine that they'll go back to their patient-doctor chain interaction between the two of them to make them relax when they come to see you. So you don't get any effectiveness and they don't get any change. So you can actually, I guess it's Mara Salvi Polazali, who doesn't want any Freud. Jung said there will be no intercourse between the two of you while you are in therapy with me.
Down in the waiting list.
It's a Zen master quality of top level. Pardon? Oh, he wanted to make it clear that the affect was centralized. Just like the business, if you want to fail at psychotherapy, one of the best ways is to set it up so that you see one of the individuals, somebody else sees another one, and somebody sees the couple, and somebody sees the family. So you have this, the transference is split just like the step family or adoptive family, so that there's never enough affective centralization to make it work. Like this recent story about the black principal, school principal. Did you hear about that with a baseball bat and a bullhorn? It's very clear that, and that's one of the rules of being a good parent. If you aren't willing to be hated, you shouldn't have children. And it's damn clear if you aren't willing to be hated, you shouldn't be a psychotherapist. And Winnicott, one of the greats of child psychiatry, has long since said, if you haven't been hated by your psychiatrist, your therapist, you've been cheated. And this, I think, is the same thing with the parents. If your parents don't care enough about you to blow up at you, to lose their control system because of how much you mean to them, then I think you have been cheated. Speaking of this morning, Dave and I were driving in. I've forgotten how it came up. A woman I saw with her husband. She'd had previous therapy. Her husband had then gone to her therapist. She was mad at that, and she went and slept with the therapist, and then told him that if he didn't kick her husband out of therapy, she would tell her husband. So partway into the couples therapy, she said to me, I don't understand why you're just talking to my husband. I thought, I don't trust you. At which point she threw her cup of coffee in my face and ruined my tape recorder. And I backed her up against the wall. I didn't touch her, but I was mad as hell. I backed her up against the wall and said, don't you ever do anything like that to me again. 3 years later, last year, gosh, it must be more than that, I got a nice letter from her saying how much that experience had meant and how appreciative she was of its having happened. So this is the pistol. The question that was being asked up here, what about the cop's gun? I think you break the program. Her programming was such that if she lost her temper and acted, she wouldn't be retaliated against. And I scared her. Again, we'll get into tomorrow. That's what happened with him. I think he suddenly became a whole person. I heard that business of separating role from personhood. And it may well be that the effective existential shift. Is that a term anybody knows about? There was an analyst in New York who invented it, and I got intrigued by it. It means that the past disappears and the future disappears, and you're right. Very unusual. I've seen, I suppose, just a few happenings like that. And I think that's what happened with the cop. He suddenly lost control of his role and moved into being a whole person. And right there in that middle moment of confrontation, he changed the patient into a real person, not a injured child, paranoid, delusional, neurotic, whatever you'd call him up there on the bridge. Retaliatory. I think suicide is always a two-person event, like craziness and murder, and not a one-person. Nobody kills themselves. Somebody wants to be dead, and somebody else wants them dead. And it's that coordination that makes it happen. And I think what he did was screwed up the work because he cared. No matter whether mother, father, brother, sister, wife, kids didn't care, he'd convinced himself of that lie. That some of them would be better like him dead. But the cop did care, and he didn't know what to do with that. He didn't have time enough to fit it into his previous programmed delusion system. So he had to respond in kind. He had to become a human being instead of a bitter ex-wimp. Want me to go a little further? Oh, we had gotten to the question of how to increase your capacity to join. And I think it's not really too much of a problem as the therapist, because of disease. You know, the disease of the character structure, the character defect that makes people into therapists is the super mom delusion that I can join and my nurturant qualities will make everything good. So it's not really a problem, and it's one of the things, of course, you get trained in. I have this weird thing, I can be smart, that what they do with us, and I want to talk to them about it a lot. So one of the things they do is they say, without ever saying it, whoever comes into your office, you give them your right breast. And if they bite the nipple, then you put it back in and give them the other one. And you know, that's not funny. You know, that's really gruesome and amazingly true. That's what I call the Mother Teresa thing. You know, the delusion that everything the culture has done can be undone by good psychotherapy. Everything the genetics, the biology of the individual has done can be undone by good psychotherapy. I remember our staff struggling with this once. The question was, what are the limits to psychotherapy? And the one I still remember from that half day of conference the 8 of us put on with each other, could you regrow an amputated leg? I don't think we ever decided that you couldn't. You know, a group to be that crazy is something else. Anyway, how you learn as a person, not as a therapist now. We're still talking about how to become more of a person. Claude and I have these ideas. That one of them is returning to your own family without purpose. Not to be their therapist, which is what they sent you out to do, or to keep from doing. You know, if I get good enough, I'll go back and cure my mother. But you go without purpose. You go to rejoin. And I think it's most effective if you can go in the frame of being a child again. if you can go back and cuddle your mother, if you can go back and cuddle your father, if you can go back and eat at their table without trying to tell them about your table manners or their table manners or what the hell ever. That's the capacity to rejoin. And then the next step, leave there without an excuse. Leave there because you are going on your own again. You leave there like leaving for college a second time. And how to do that without even running away in the middle of the night or saying your wife needs you or the next step in this territory, as I thought about it this morning, and maybe you can help me get further, because I don't think of this as complete. It's just something I'm started working on and got excited about. Family reunions as professional training. I got kicked into this. Let me back off 1 second and tell you something I'll probably say again tomorrow morning. One of the breaks in my life is that I've never had any training. It's a fluke. I finished my obstetrical training in 1938. I decided to go back and start medical practice in Syracuse. I heard that there was a possibility of getting a psychiatric fellowship for a year right next to the obstetrical hospital. I thought, well, I'll case the joint and see the good obstetrician and see if I can go into practice with him. I never went near that hospital. There are reasons probably behind that. But that's when I started my psychiatry thing. After I'd fallen in love with schizophrenia, with 2 or 3 of these exciting experiences that you can have in that kind of a peeping Tom set, when you're just beginning to see gross psychotics, I decided I was going to find out how it happened. So I applied for a fellowship in child psychiatry and got assigned to Louisville and went down there and just did play therapy. That's all that we were supposed to do, was just sit in a room with one little child after another for an hour each. Well, and I did that for a solid year. But all the good psychiatrists there had gone off to Europe for a little war going on. So I was suddenly told, you will teach psychiatry to the medical students. After all, if you've been trained in obstetrics, obviously you can teach And then I went to work in the delinquent institution outside of Louisville for 2 or 3 years, and I went on teaching in the medical students, trying to keep one chapter ahead of the guys who were supposed to be doing it. And then still nobody came back who knew anything about psychiatry. And this medical school had to have a chairman of psychiatry, so I had pulled a couple of fancy tricks, and I got hired to be the chairman, not knowing anything about psychiatry or about how to be a chairman. And so it's gone on through the years. I've never had any real training. I learned it all from residents, from medical students, from families, etc. And I less and less ashamed of advising you to do the same thing. I've even found a way of saying how you can do it in training. 2 of you get together. You get together with a peer, and you get a supervisor to work with the twosome, so you can at least outvote them. Because the problem of being taught is that you end up becoming a better and better imitation. You try to do what the other person told you was the right thing to do. So the problem you have here is how to debunk what I'm sticking with. How to make your life into something rather than trying to pick up ways of imitating life or otherwise places. And that's very tricky. Look at the president, you know, they're all imitating everybody, including their advertising manager. So the family reunion that I got invited into 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, there was a split in a family group such that in a small town For 15 years, one half of the family hadn't been allowed to speak to the other half, even though they lived, I don't know, 15 each. I ended up with, I think, 32 or 33 people. Looking back now, I made a serious mistake in not forcing the third sibling in the mid-generation to come. I let the two siblings and the children and the grandparents be enough. And the one person I didn't get in, I think, poisoned the effectiveness. We'll take more about that tomorrow. But I met with these people 12 hours a day for 3 days in a row. And it was quite an experience. The guy wrote a book that never did get published, but we had videotapes of the whole thing. But out of that has gradually evolved this family reunion business, which we've now done, Muriel and I have now done, I suppose, 20, in which somebody sets up and talks to me about getting together, and we push to get more and more and more people until we get everybody we possibly can to meet for 3 days a nearby spa so we can go back and forth to home secure. And then they live together for 3 days, and we see them from 10 to 12 and 2 to 4 each day for the 3 days, and then they go away, which is wonderful. The thing that's fascinating is that over these 6 or 8 years, even this original group, who met again each year for the next 3 or 4 years and got to be 80 people who were meeting, they never invited me back. But these other groups, the same thing. It's as though the 3D is like the revolver. Some strange way crashing into the system. And the crash is not particularly dangerous. It's just like we're talking here. I don't play any emergency games. Makes a difference in the way they get together, which is part of another mystery. I suppose 90% of the families I've seen in psychotherapy, someone or someones have had individual therapy, and it hasn't worked. Almost never have I seen a family in family therapy where anyone has then gone on for individual therapy. That's really a haunt. Why in the hell, if you have family therapy, whether it works or doesn't work, you wouldn't go on to a PhD in individual therapy where you struggle with your intrapsychic world? And it's almost as though the interpersonal world, if it's handled as such, makes the intrapsychic world, which is really a dream interpersonal world. You know, my inside world is a dream of what happens between me and my family members and my friends and so forth. That's not a real world. That's all a fantasy. That's a daytime dream. And it's almost as though when you get the family together and you disrupt the intrapsychic family that each of us lives with, that changes the intrapsychic world, but only the fantasy. And that's why it doesn't always work, or frequently doesn't work. Or if you change the interpersonal world, and it suddenly looks like mother isn't like you thought, and daddy isn't like you thought, then the intrapsychic, I don't know, fades, changes, becomes less important, is known to be a fantasy, and then you don't live by it anymore. But anyway, the same thing has happened with the family reunions. One of them was a family with 13 family members, including the divorced wife and the divorced husband, which we forced in, either that or no me. She was still waiting for the old husband to come back to her, like a good mother waiting for her child. And she was still mad at him because he was an old-time drunk. And is still at it, I guess. But we met for 3 days with these 13 people, 11 of whom were therapists. You know, no single one has ever called me back and said, "Can we meet again?" And the same thing with a good many others with the same kind of thing. You know, most of the people who do this are therapists, and or they started in their family and get their family together. So this was what I was suggesting for you as a way to get an interpersonal shake-up of your life. And I don't think it has to be confrontation. I don't think it has to be starting a fight or starting a love fest. I think it's just a question of being together with a therapist. And that's because he uses a different language. I'm having a fascinating time with coining languages. We can get into this again tomorrow. The patient's language is the language of pain and impotence. The therapist's initial language is the language of inference. Everything you say infers something else. And like the cop was saying, you know, the inference that this pain and competence of the guy on the bridge was that the cop would feel guilty or to blame. So the inference that came from this pain, the cop then responded, but he inferred that he was responsible and drew his gun. The language of inference. The third language, which is the language of the mid-phase of therapy, is the language of options. She says, but don't you think if my husband is going to screw around this that I ought to get a divorce? And I said, well, you know, there are possibilities. You could hit him in the back of the head with a brick and I'll defend your murder because I think it was a crime of passion. Or you could put an ad in the paper saying that you have discovered that your husband's homosexual. Or you could just walk off to San Francisco and get a job and leave him with the kids. Change your name. I think he'd learn fast. Or you could tell him that you've been trying not to tell him, but you've been having an affair for 3 years with this best friend of his, or his brother. There are other possibilities, you know, that you haven't thought of. And, well, do you think I should get a divorce? And I said, well, actually, I don't think I'd be available, you know. Well, I wasn't trying to proposition you. Well, then why would I care whether you got a divorce or not? Well, she said, I just wanted professional advice. Oh, I'm glad to give you that. If you're going to get a divorce, don't you ask anybody or tell anybody. That's your special pain. And you can stay on and suffer like you've been suffering for 10 years, or you can get rid of him, and then you may suffer less or more, but in a different way. But you better decide that yourself, because you're going to be the one that suffers. I won't suffer if you get divorced. I won't even suffer if he goes on screwing around. So that language of options. And it's strangely enough, the further out the options are, the more useful they seem to be. Like if you say to somebody who's declaring suicide, you know what? If you're going to commit suicide, you know what you ought to do? You ought to get the people together you hate and kill all of them off before you kill yourself. Because you might have all the fun you can have. If you're going to go, you might as well go in victory, you know. Like Martin Luther King said, if you're going to sin gloriously. I guess that was Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King. You'll just have to forgive my Alzheimer's. It's so I think you could have this kind of family interview with your extended family for your training. Hour, 2 hours. I think there ought to be a therapist there. There ought to be somebody who adds the other languages. The language of options, the language of inference, who will see things that you don't all see. And it may not at all necessitate content. Psychotherapy, depending on content, I think is very sleazy in comparison. I remember coming into a group therapy group. We had 10 groups going on for a while. And I said, you know, I'm very upset. I've had a terrible thing today in my life. And I can't tell you a thing. I don't intend to tell you a thing about it, but I sure need help. You know, it was as though I had told them the whole story. I got just as much help having denied any content as I think I could have if I had told them what the hell ever it was that had upset me. Very surprising. One of those other lessons that I learned about psychotherapy and don't know what to do with. So if you have the family therapy training, you take responsibility for getting it for you. You be careful that you're not trying to straighten out something in the family. You're not trying to invent a new level of health in your family. Oh, you just want to get a videotape for the future. This can be a kind of family portrait, like a family memory bank of snapshots, a family videotape of the family talking about itself. The next one is back to the business of individuation. I think one of the ways to individuate is travel. I don't think it makes a difference too much how you travel. It just means that you rock your own world. I remember we saw a guy, one of the residents went out and saw a guy 20 miles out of Madison. Said he ought to go back to the hospital in Madison. He said, look, I've been living in this little town for 55 years. I've never been beyond the town lines, and I don't intend to. You know, this kind of social hermit, I think a lot of us tend to get into that. And there's a loss the other way. I grieve many times because I left the Adirondacks, I left Syracuse, I left New York City, I left Louisville, I left Oak Ridge, Tennessee, I left Atlanta, I left Madison. But the disruption in your life when you move somewhere else, when you break out of your security and face your individuation, your separateness, I think is a worthwhile part of your growing. And I don't know if it makes too much difference what your travel is. You know? One of the family interviews I think of, and this may have been starting part of my own thinking, I ran into a social worker I'd known in New York City who was telling me the experience she'd had. Her grandmother had died and left the family, quote, unquote, $10,000, which was to take the 12 of them up the inside passageway from Seattle to wherever the top of that is and back for 12 days. And she said that experience for that extended family of living on that boat, and every day once or so they would get a chance to go off and separate from each other for an hour, and then they'd have to come back and eat together and talk together and be together. She said she didn't know whether her grandmother had given them a gift or punishment. It was terrible. So travel is individuation and the family meeting. Then another way to individuate, I think we talked about, that work can be a way of individuating or a way of joining, and should be both. You should not individuate so that your work becomes something that you hate and you only do because you have to have the money. It should not be some place where you stay because you belong and you're secure and you'll have retirement in 20 years. It's amazing what happens when you find people who've been in the Army for 20 years and they're staying to get the fringe benefits after they leave, or people who've taught in medical schools for 20 years. Well, let's not talk about them. So you ought to have jobs that set you up with flexibility and security. And the obvious way to do that is to have two, so that you never got both feet in the same place. Ain't generalizations wonderful? Then I want the next thing, and then, or maybe stop now. You want to stop now? Questions you want to bring up? I got two more bits. Okay, how to build a healthy family. I think the essence of breaking out of this pathology of marriage that I was talking about, the 4 different things that make marriage a screwed up combination. You remember? Symbiosis, adoption, pseudotherapy, and scapegoat. The thing that you're heading for, if the marriage is growing as it should, is a series of psychological divorces and remarriages. I ran onto this in a very unique way. I was doing a set of radio programs with one of them talk show people in Madison, and one day we were talking about divorce, and this incisive character said, "How can you know about divorce if you've never been divorced? Because you can only be on one side." And I heard myself say, "Well, I've been divorced 5 times, but it's always from the same woman." And then it dawned on me some hours later. I said 5, I've had 6 children. The first 5 were like 2 years apart. Then there was an 8-year gap, and we had another one, the boon of our old age. But it dawned on me that someplace I was telling myself, by the 6th child I was able to be undivorced. I was able to really be a part of that experience in a different and, I assume, hopefully, a more humanistic way. Which tells you some more about what I believe about men. That when this woman has an affair with this other organism inside of her belly, he is left out. And that's what I want to talk about schizophrenia when we get into that tomorrow. So, the first one then is how to evolve a breakout of this pathology that we call marriage. And the problem is how to become peers. How the husband and wife can become peers. And that's, of course, one of the things you have to fight and learn to keep from happening in your therapeutic office. You should never be a peer with your patient. And I think it's more critical than that. I think you probably can never become a peer to an ex-patient. Or if so, it's damn rare. I have a couple of those experiences which I think probably worked out pretty well. But in all of the other hundreds and hundreds over that 50 years, it's conspicuously impossible. I went back to do a survey, 6 years ago, with people, families I had seen 5 years before, and on back from there. I sent out a big questionnaire, 3 or 4 pages of fancy language, one of which was, "Can I come visit?" And I got back a fair number of those, and one of the residents and I took him along to sort of help me not get locked in, went into the first home, was a senior retired professor of international law. One of those people. And his wife, who had been the facilitator between the state government and the federal government for the governor. That kind of people. This was 4 years later. It was 5 minutes after the last interview. The transference was just eking out of the pores, and it was useless. It was very clear that I could not do a follow-up, that all I was doing was having another interview. We went to the next one, a young lady who'd had 4 years of analysis in New York City before she came to Atlanta and was tearing her face with her fingernails. I refused to see her except with her husband. He'd worked out quite well. He became the lawyer for the university's faculty protest group. She was a very competent social worker who was doing a very good trick, by the way. She'd attached herself to a medical clinic to be the scapegoat they sent their bad patients to, and was doing very well. She made a mistake which I didn't catch on until she called me. The medical people had started asking her for therapy, and she was making the mistake of trying to offer that. But we saw those people, the same thing happen. The treatment had been very successful. The follow-up was a complete flop. And it was so painful and so obviously unworkable, I don't even remember the third one. After the third one, we gave up and decided it couldn't be done. And since I'm not interested in research, I've never gone back. So the first thing is to develop a peer relationship between you and the spouse. And I think a large part of that has to do with somehow you're getting a way around each other's craziness. That family, that in-law family, is crazy. Everybody knows that. And what's even worse, your spouse is crazy too. And that isn't bad enough. She thinks you're crazy, and that's impossible. She doesn't even get along with your mother, you know. So part of becoming peers is some kind of accommodation with this craziness, like the kind of thing that's going on between Russia and the United States. You know, this decision that they're impossible, and their decision that we're impossible, is being gradually altered by something. I read this a long while ago. The realization on the part of each of us, the other one's going to be there. You know, there's nothing you can do. They aren't going to go away. They probably aren't going to be democratic. And we probably aren't going to be communist. And it's a terrible thought. And it's almost impossible to imagine. But you learn to accommodate it. And between the two spouses, this same thing. If you can get adapted to each other's craziness, that you can let her spill the toothpaste, or you know, or not fold the towels, or she can let you leave your socks on the floor without having a fit because her mother wouldn't let her leave the socks on the floor. On and on, you know. So the spouses as peers. Another one, which is an interesting one that I happened onto a long while ago, and I haven't really developed it, so I know too much about it. Some kind of contract of a bilateral veto. That the twosome, to be well structured, I think, needs the right to veto. If you coordinate, it's because you're both ready. If one is ready and the other one feels they have to go along, then you're not there. You're playing. You're manipulating. And that probably induces a kind of Mahatma Gandhi retaliation. So this bilateral veto. The third one, is one I hadn't really thought of before, and I guess I don't believe in. I just think it's true. That you shouldn't hide differences. And I don't know how you get there, but I think it's critical. I think you ought to face the fact of differences. And that's part, I guess, of the same thing of the accepting the fact of the other person's craziness as being something you don't have to cure, they aren't going to get over, like the United States-Russia thing. Then the fourth one, the baby as a we. The baby is not a separate person. The baby is the personification of the we-ness between the parents. And if you don't believe that, talk to somebody who's lost some woman. Women never disappear. You know, it's 93% of single parents are women? Or 97%? There's no father who sticks around to take care of the kids. You know, he takes off with some other person who makes him believe he's 18. Uh, but the baby is a biological replica of the we, and as such has a power that can't be matched. Your face and his face, or your face and her face, are both there. The fifth one in this building a healthy family is using the baby as a psychotherapist. And if you do family therapy, for God's sakes, don't ever do it without all the little baby you can get. I've had a family with 7 members, 2 sets of grandparents, everybody paranoid, and they bring in a little, 9-month, 10-month-old baby, and I seduce the baby, and everything is different. It's just magic, because you can be intimate with a baby like you can't be intimate with anybody else. And when you get the baby transferred to you, you got the whole family. So they say, how long after the baby's born do you want him in therapy? Well, 15 minutes. Like my old obstetrician chief said, how long after the baby is born can we have intercourse? And he said, well, wait till I get out of the room. I think he was lying, but then... And the final one, the number 6, and that's 2 of those 6 that are new for me. The final one is a 2-family alliance. If you can work out an alliance between your family and your spouse's family, you got a healthy family by virtue, by fiat. It's just, I think, a real automatic. And all but impossible. I didn't hear you.
I was going to say that might explain why a lot of arranged marriages seem to work out in other countries.
Sure. And a lot of arranged marriages work out better than these make-believe romance marriages that we have. Where, and I have this, you guys are really turning me on. I think the thing that happened in the sexual revolution is right into this. That what frequently happened was that the penis and vagina went off on a trip together and there were no people along. And I'm really suspicious that the people never got there. It's really a dissociative process. It's a hysterical dissociation. I think frequently takes place. And the dissociation is so complete that there's no possibility. Somebody did a very extensive, high-priced research project of re-educating 20 prostitutes in New York City. They financed it, they moved them up the ladder psychologically, sociologically, professionally. I think, as I remember it, they all got married, they all finished college, and they had done, how these people do things. 20 years later, they did a follow-up, or 15 years later. You know what happened? 18 of them were back into prostitution, either professionally or amateurishly. What it means really is the same thing, that having set up an hysterical dissociation between vagina and person, it's not possible, or they weren't able to put them back together except in a very, very low percentage. And I don't know, people, I think people are hopeless. I don't quite know how we could get a world without them, but it's worth thinking about. Questions? When do we break?
10 minutes for that.
Okay. Questions for 10 minutes.
You mentioned how in suicide, the person kills, sometimes tries to kill himself and then others. There's been an increase in family suicide, like a person will kill themselves and kill members of their family.
Yeah.
How do you tie that in maybe?
Oh, I think it's the same thing. I think long time decision that suicide has to do with a reversal of murder. That you are so horrified at your impulse to kill somebody else that you can't tolerate it or may never even know about it and end up killing yourself out of bitterness of what you're going to do. The same thing that Freud did with the homosexuals. Remember that? Fascinating. I never read Freud except one of his little books, the one on ego. But he had, I pick up bits along the way from other students, that the guy says, I'm not attracted to another man. He's attracted to me. I don't love him. I hate him. I don't really hate him. He hates me. So you end up with homosexuality producing the paranoid, destructive delusion system. And I think this is the same process. And in my early work with families, when you take a suicide, graduate students, in my medical school community, we had 40,000 students, 12,000 graduate students. So we had a long list of graduate students who were trying to finish their thesis and attempted suicide. You know, they were waiting to get into the psychiatric hospital after they'd made the first attempt. If you want to start practice, by the way, go into any small college town and put an ad in the paper, group therapy for people who can't finish their thesis. That's one of the secrets of the dialectic. You can only be as crazy as you can be tricky. If you're crazy and not tricky, you're put in the hospital. If you're tricky and not crazy, you end up getting to be president. So you have to balance these two. And what I'm offering you really tomorrow is more tricks. More, and maybe not a good word, I don't know. Understanding professional competence. Professional methodologies of handling the job of being a role-fixed professional therapist, not an amateur do-gooder like giving a Thanksgiving turkey every year, making believe that that's welfare.
I have a question. How you something like a hysterical conversion reaction from the point of view?
Sure. That's a long-term great research that came out of the psychoanalytic movement. It was started with the hysterical stuff. Genet and the other maestros who were doing the hypnosis that started Freud going on the free associations were handling hysteria. And the one I always think of is most obvious: mother gets sick, has stroke, or unable to be there, and daughter gives father his bed bath. She has this unconscious, many times unaware, impulse to masturbate him. She's horrified at herself, and the next morning her arm is paralyzed, and that can stay there for 20 years. She never knows it. He never knows it. It's a fact. It's not just a psychological trick. And that's what hysteria is. I remember a guy come back from the World War II when we were running a VA hospital ward, who was blind, hysterically blind. But if, I've forgotten how the episode was, if he was called to dinner, or somebody had an epileptic on the ward, he would find his way around those chairs without ever touching one of them. The rest of the time he'd stumble. And I think he really was blind. I think he really had an hysterical blindness which turned off when the emergency was up. I think that's kind of what hysteria is. It's like hypnosis. Hypnosis is a real thing. Altered state of consciousness is not any fake. You can really deliver a baby, cut off a leg, take out teeth under hysterical or hysterical, under hypnosis without pain. And it's mysterious, you know. Like Hitler took over the whole German world. That's a massive process. Well, look at these radio characters. If they only all control, maybe we'll get rid of them. Well, if they get one to be president, then we'll do it.
When you talk about working with the family all together, does that mean everybody all together for every session?
Let's talk about that tomorrow. It means everybody you can get for every time you can get them, and be careful. But we'll talk a lot about that.
Go back to work and the opportunity to individuate and join.
Yeah.
Talk more about that.
Well, I think if, for instance, if you can work in a clinic half-time and private practice half-time, or if you can, best one, I've had a series of telephone supervision conferences I do once a month with a group one place or another. And the first one was a group in southern Minnesota. Some little farm country town decided that they would call me up, and we had this county group of 8 or 10 people who were doing welfare work and probation work, and we met once a week for an hour on the telephone. They had a speaker telephone, and I was on the other end. But finally I couldn't stand it anymore, and I went over to visit them, which meant going up to Minneapolis and back down on another plane. And in the middle of the afternoon, here comes these 3 girls of the group, high as kites. They had just spent 3 weeks training to be farm auctioneers, and they were going to do psychotherapy a half day a week. So they found a place, they had the security, and now the excitement. Or one of my residents, an ex-resident, a good family therapist, back practicing in Atlanta with the old group that I belonged to 20 years ago, called up the other day. He's decided to go into ethology. He's going to go back to graduate school, do his psychiatric medical practice part-time to earn himself enough living, but he's going to become an ethologist. He's going to get his PhD. How crazy can you get? But that kind of, he wants the excitement of this thing that Lorenz did with animals, and that he's been turned on about, and decided the hell with just being a workaholic.
Why do you have to separate? Why can't you get the security and the flexibility from the same place?
Oh, I think you can. I think it's pretty unusual. I think ordinarily people who get into a clinic and stay there for 5 years lose their flexibility. Or said another way, I spent 10 years with this group of 8 people teaching medical students, running a department of psychiatry. They got mad at us, we got mad at them. We left and set up a private clinic. The 8 of us spent 10 years practicing together. Then I got this invitation to come to Madison to be a professor there. It was 2 years later before it dawned on me how much the group that I originated and ran for 20 years had restricted my creativity. I started not wearing a tie. I started talking more freely. I started writing in a very different way. I started writing by myself instead of with a group of 4, which we'd been doing for 8 years. And I don't know what that means. I don't think it means you can't, just like have a successful family with foster children or adopted children or stepchildren, or a successful marriage. The first marriage doesn't mean the successful marriage can't be workable. The fourth can be useful. I don't think there's as much chance as the first or the second, because I think each time you get more paranoid. You know, by the time you've had married with a lot of people. Or you get like, I saw a family in Santa Barbara, I don't know about Reagan, but anyway, 3 generations, the grandmother had 2 of her spouses and her present boyfriend with her. The mother had 2 of her ex-spouses. The daughter had her boyfriend and her ex-spouse. It was a very friendly group. You know, nobody was mad at anybody. You know, I had the feeling there weren't any people. All there were was current affairs and ex-affairs. It was really weird, because they thought it was fine. They couldn't understand why this young daughter was worrying about her boyfriend, because the first guy obviously wasn't a good husband for her. But so I think it's possible to work those things out. I think I'm trying to fantasy the best. Break for coffee and be back?
Yeah, let's take a break for 15. I have a message for Sharon Revere. We're just trying to decide what that means. Okay, we have a little more than an hour or so to go until about 4:30. Carl's going to open the floor to some questions, and then he has a little more to present, and we'll close off the question period at the end.
I had a question which was related to the relationship with your father.
Oh, yes. I told you the story about my first interview as a patient there. And I talked about my mother, and then he dropped this quiet bomb of, how was it with your father? It's been very slow evolving, my understanding is. One of the things, I guess it's kind of come up today, although I've played with it a little before, the genetic inheritance. He was a very soft, passive workaholic. His father ran a sawmill in the middle of the Adirondacks at what's called Whitaker's Falls. So the workaholism has come down through the generations. When my son was 15 or so, I asked him, you thought of going into medicine? He said, hell, I should work my tail off like you do. I know. So he wasn't going to be a workaholic. Now he runs a, what do they call these things? These people who move executives from one corporation to another. Yeah. And in Houston. But if I want to call him Sunday morning, the office. You know, so he's just as much a workaholic as the 3 previous generations. So part of what I got from my father was, I think, this genetic. That's become more and more clear to me. One is that I'm more a Saint Bernard than a German Shepherd. It's very difficult for me to be angry. I've learned how to be angry in interviews, as though that particular focused professional set makes it possible for me to be more my anger available. I remember my father being angry only twice. Well, let's not try, 3 times. Once was when a team of horses wouldn't take a load of hay off the hay barn floor. They would do this, and he used a whip to make them move together. Once was when a hired man cursed in front of me when I was 3 or 4 or 5, and he picked the guy up by the shirt and the pants and walked him up to the house 50 yards or so. Said, sit right down and you get out. Another one was years later when he was scoutmaster and I was one of the Boy Scouts, and the senior patrol leader, the junior chief of the group, did something, I don't know what it was. He did the same thing with him. He picked him up and carried him over to the door and set him down and said, when you can be a gentleman, come back. But the big things that happened when I burned down the sugar bush, the hired man time to increase the speed with which the sugar was being boiled off, and we didn't realize you had to release the petcock to let in more sap, so we burned the place down. No anger. You know, it's like this is just part of how life is. Or when I went over the edge of the ditch with the tractor with a load and a hay wagon behind it. And here I was up to this far with the tractor mostly underwater in the river. And it took him the rest of the day, I guess, maybe with a wrecker to come and pull it out. I don't remember any anger. Now, maybe blocking, that may be a complete, but I don't think so. I think he just wasn't. And I have a son-in-law who worked in a farm like that when he was a teenager, and things, and he and I have laughed about the fact that the same thing happened there. He was working, plowing for this farmer, and, I don't know, wrecked the whole setup somehow or other. And went back to report to the farmer, and the farmer just said, well, that's how it is. Like, there are certain people who are like German Shepherds and other people who are like St. Bernards. If you're St. Bernard, you're probably not very good as a house guard. And if you're a German Shepherd, you're probably not very good as a rescue person in the Alps. So I think that part of my... There is in me a kind of sadism which I discovered way back and decided if I did not have what it took to have that part of me, I wouldn't be who I wanted to be. So I had the experience of that. I don't really know too much about it. I assume it's there. I assume it may be part of my humor, or part of those things that I utilize with more trickery. I think that's part of my craziness, and if your craziness is matched by an equal amount of trickiness, an equal amount of technical expertise or patterned handling of it, then you can be more and more crazy and get away with it more and more. I don't think that was true with my dad. I think of that as something I worked out myself. I think my father was a little boy to my mother, and that I'm still a little boy to my wife. Not in her, in me. That it's very easy and very standard for me to become 2 or 5 or 7 to you, to anybody. I think of that as an asset. I think of it also as pathology. It's ridiculous to be 76 and still not fight with the garage man if you don't get a good repair job. Which is standard for me. I think I'm also largely nonverbal, believe it or not. I can remember when I suppose I was 10, in the middle of the big kitchen table for the noon hour meal, which on a farm is, 4,000 calories, and in the middle of the dinner, out of I don't know where, certainly not out of any friendliness, I said, shit. It was a dead silence. 5 hours later, I was on top of the hay wagon, and he was pitching up the last bits of hay. And he said as though to himself, it wouldn't have been so bad if it hadn't sounded so natural. Of course, it wasn't very important because I've never remembered it since, I can't see. Yeah.
When you talk about men and women, I hear a real reverence for women a lot of the time and a fair amount of hopelessness around the men. And in myself, being a woman, it gives me a certain amount of anxiety because my experience is that when I've been put up on a pedestal, I also get to put one down at some point along the way. And I'm wondering if you get that reaction from other people, and how you see your vision of men and your vision of women affect your work with male clients.
Yep. Again, I'll get some more of that tomorrow, but let me give you a brief. I think the essence of family understanding is chess. If you don't play chess, you should learn it on purpose to know about families. Because I don't think it has to do with kingdoms. I think it's lasted for thousands of years. It's why the Russians are running the world. It has to do with a king and a queen who are married. They each have a bishop. If you get into a problem with the family and it turns out they're not the same religion, or more or less of religion, my father was, I think, less religious. My mother was very religious. Those two, they each have their own bishop. They each have their own castle, family of origin, and they each have a knight, a mysterious extra character. I don't know whether that's a grandmother with money, or a high school girlfriend, or an uncle who favors them, but there's another factor. In front of these revered adults are 8 children who protect the oldsters from the world. If you're doing family therapy, you need to know some extra things. One of them comes from a New Yorker cartoon. The queen is saying to the king, "Hell, even when you're on my side, you can only move one tiny move." And that's very true. The husband is essentially, symbolically very important. You can't even get him. You know, as soon as you corner him, the game is over. Of course, he's utterly impotent, you know, but he's very important. And what the other part of it is that the king is impotent, has no value as such. He's just symbolically the top. The queen is equal to 9, one more than all of the children. She is so powerful, you better not touch her until you have all the rest of your game set up. There's a couple of other funny things. The castle, the family of origin, moves in straight lines, as families do. The bishop, like the TV evangelist, only goes you know, if you're doing family therapy, you ought to learn about metaphors. You know, they carry so much power. That's the symbolic experience. I can remember so many times the residents coming to me and said, "Hey, you know, I saw a family this morning and I lost him in the first interview." And I would say automatically after 20 years, "How was with you and mother?" It's funny you should ask. Because if you alienate mother, they'll never come back. If you seduce mother, they'll never come back. So you have to do the same thing as a chess game. Be sure to get the father in, because if he doesn't come back, you've lost it without losing it. You know, you've become the new king, and you're in big trouble. Because then all the kids will treat you like a stepfather. But if you lose the queen, the game is all over, practically speaking. Actually, good old Freud should have heard this. If you get one of the children over onto the other side, you can have 2 queens. Oedipus, you know? You can make one of the children into a queen. It's tricky, but Sigmund did it, Anna said. Tell you a story about the chess game. I saw a family with 5 children. Father was a physician, very competent. I think it was the youngest daughter with a full-blown paranoid skits with special extras. Her trick was to go into bars, write poems about some guy on the other side of the bar, and arrange for him to see it, and then he would beat her up. And she was doing this pretty regularly. And Father had her on Thursday. I got to see them for 5 or 6 interviews before Father took her back to medication and backed out. The fascinating thing was, I didn't discover till about the 4th interview that she was a good Catholic, and he had converted at the time of marriage. She had 3 good children on her side, good Catholic children. These were all teenagers or up. He had 2. One was an atheist, one was schizophrenic. So you can see why I think about the difference between the power of the mother and the father. It's a good example. So you need to, you know, there's a special move in chess called castling the king, in which you move 3 men at one time. So the king is behind his bishop and next to his family of origin. So, and then has 3 children out in front of him. So you really put him back into a secure place. And that's what you need to do with the father. And the first thing he comes in. Get him into the set. Your respect for him, your request that he tell the story of the family and their troubles, so that he's locked in. Otherwise his car will break down, or his boss will demand he go to podunk, or what the hell. And you'll be lost.
Can you speak to the differences in working with families that voluntarily are coming in and others that are forced to come in because of age
Trouble. Yep. I think there is a lot of difference between families who come in on their own volition and families who come under pressure. I think the question is a tricky one again, how you handle it. And I think you need to separate, and we'll talk some more about this, your father function of control, authority, reports, diagnosis, blah, 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 and the mother function of being a therapist. I think essentially, unless you've got a fairly mild situation, you should not try to do both. If you're smart, you'll get a probation worker to do all the authoritative stuff so that you can be the therapist, or you'll be the authoritative probation worker and somebody else will do the therapy. If you do both, you have to change hats so often, and they get paranoid about which one you're wearing, and you've lost it. Our best example is one I saw many years ago. They started a new court where everybody who got a divorce had to have an interview before they got divorced to make sure they were for real. And of course they hired social workers fresh out because they were cheaper. And within a matter of no time, I had a bunch of panicky social workers. You know, all day long they listened to one set of couples after another talking about the horror, and they were going crazy. And the answer was very simple. You say to them, look, I'm working for the judge. My job is to find out whether you really want a divorce or whether you're just trying to help each other work out some way of living together. I'm not your therapist. Don't tell me anything you don't want the judge to know. And I'll refer you to a therapist if you want. I will not be your therapist. So they became in the role of the authority, the oldest child, if you will, and turned down their impulse, the pathology that I think we all have, of being a nurturant mother. And it was a very magical move. And I think you need to do that with your own role. You need to make sure where you are. And I think basically, what I'll talk about tomorrow, you re-empower the family to be their own therapist. So you don't get the job, you just take it and force them to take it back.
I'm curious with the family reunion idea. Did you tell people that there was going to be a therapist there, or was it just inviting everyone there and having...
Oh no. This current one is a girl who's just finishing her training in California is due out week after next or something, called up to ask if she'd heard about it and could we do it, and said, sure, get them all together and tell them that I wouldn't be willing or comfortable meeting unless you can get everybody there that's worth anything in the family, and that you want to do it for your training, and that you're going to pay for it, and that you're not up to changing the family. You're just up to trying to learn to belong to it and learning how to be part of a family so you can help other people be part of their family. Does that answer your question, or was I skidding around it?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was like a surprise that there was...
Oh, no. Oh, no. No, and I'm very free to say to them, if any of those people want to call me about it, I'm glad to talk to them about what I think is going on. And I'm not trying to solve any problems, and I don't care. You can keep all the secrets you want. I'm not There's a wonderful story about the senator who went over to the Korean War and said to one of the GIs, do you have any pornography? When they were worrying about things. He said, General, I don't even have a pornograph. So I've gotten at this place where I don't even have a pornograph anymore. I don't care what they think is wrong or what they've found out about each other. I've already seen enough stuff so I can get along without it.
Did you ever go through a time in your practice where,
Yes.
What did you do?
I moved on to something else as soon as I got defeated.
Content's not important. I'm just speaking as a young therapist and being hooked into what my clients think about me and the job that I'm doing and that sort of thing. And you're talking about developing as a person, as a therapist, as opposed to the technique part of it. But in that development, getting that hook from that, what was important for you?
I guess maybe time and experience and co-therapy. I think that not having any training, I began very early to lock into asking for help. And anything that was serious, there was two of us there. I wasn't willing to take it on by myself. Now I'm more and more and more convinced, and really almost insistent, that it's crazy to bring up children all by yourself. It's crazy to try to handle a family without a we, without a team. If it's not only that you're more powerful, you can back off and look. You can learn by what happens after you say your story. And you can think about what's happening when he's into his little thing. And then you can move back in and he'll protect you. Or you can move back out and they know he doesn't agree with you, so they can listen to him and you can be temporarily off the hook. It's a completely different world. And it doesn't have to be full-time. It's best if it is, particularly if you're learning. But it can be just the second interview. You have the first interview, and the second interview is a consultant who then picks up your mother role, and this is eerie how specific this is, becomes the father to that, and then leaves, and the standard is the mother goes back to doing what she's going to do anyway, you know, and father's had his piece and gone off. But that second interview consultant makes a tremendous difference, because then you're always there with this other person. It's not, you just don't have, you're a cross-country truck driver. It doesn't mean you're not the husband. You see, it just means that you may not be back in until there's trouble, or you may be called back in 3 weeks later, or 3 months later, or whatever, by either set of persons.
Given the mother-father role you're talking about, is there any significance to
male-female?
sex of the therapist?
That given this kind of planning, is it true that it's more important to have the two sexes? I think it's very important. our first 10, 15 years of doing that, we mostly were 2 men because there were 7 men and only 1 woman in our group. And I think 2 men can almost become equal to 1 woman. One of the mysterious things to me, and I've been at this for years and years now, it's almost impossible for 2 women to team. It's eerie. It's like this is so personal and so powerful that neither one can back off and be the probation officer, even for the moment. That each one is going to solve this problem with our pathology, our nurturant character structure. 2 men can try to be nurturant. They're not very good at it, so it doesn't make too much difference. You know, the 2 of them can almost be equal to 1 woman.
What do you want to know about someone before you go in a co-therapy role with them?
Nothing. I think as a foster parent, you don't have to be significant to each other. And that the residents taught me that inch by inch. Our original group, we just lived in each other's office for 20 years. So we were intimately involved, and we knew each other like the back of the hand. But the residents would take on a co-therapy project with each other when they were still mad at each other. It's as though part of the professional role training is to isolate this experience. You'll go in, and then you're a therapist. And you come out, and you're not a therapist anymore. You're just whatever else you are. And that it's this teaming, it takes a quality of respect. It takes a freedom to let him talk out of his 3-generation background the way he thinks, and his letting you talk out of your 3-generation background about where you are. And you respect their personhood, not endeavor to coordinate your theories. Not endeavor to. Of course, if you're just being theoretical, you know, if you're doing a behavior modification stuff, and the other guy is trying to do dream analysis, it's just a little complicated. But if you're not addict to a method, but are really moving with them, I don't think it makes that kind of difference. If you're going on to do private practice with a colleague, and you're going to be in and out of each other's world all the time, not just with one patient or a series of individuals, then it may be important, but that's just like any other partnership. You need to respect each other's right to be separate. And I guess the veto. And we were talking with spouses. I had 2 guys, both senior people. One was one of my original colleagues who had come from a different kind of background and who lived off the history. He could remember what had been said 4 years before in an interview. And he and I never really coordinated. We would work together. He would do his thing, and I would shut up and listen, and then I would do my thing, and he would shut up and listen, mostly. But we didn't enjoy our cooperation in the same way. Another one was a child psychiatrist whose belief was that the children were first and the parents were just a problem. And that kind of understructure that he'd had developing for 20 years was hard for me to integrate, since I saw the family as a unit, not a child as a victim and the family as dangerous.
So could that be more dysfunctional than not, just based on what the therapists are doing?
Say it again.
Could that then be more dysfunctional than not doing anything at all? Not having
To make a decision that the 2 of you being together is much crazier than this family needs.
Yeah, I'm not sure you can ever answer that question. You know, is psychotherapy ever useful, or would it be better not go into it at all. Because the world's been going on for a long, long while without psychotherapy, and I think it's very valuable. But I wouldn't certainly want to fight with anybody about whether it's more valuable than being repressed or being manic or explosive or another culture. I think that's one of the unique things about this whole process. You need to be clear that you're a foreigner in every family, including many times your own. So in any other family, you need to realize that they have a 3, 4, 5, Murray Bowen says 10 generation custom-built system. And you can't make the family over. You can help them be more authentic. There's a wonderful story about the first generation Italian who's graduating from college. And he says, Papa, when you graduate from college, you're supposed to get a gift. And I want a watch. No watch, a pistola. Papa, I don't want a pistola. I want a watch. Shut your face. I said, you get a pistola. I said, Papa, what did I want for a pistola? Papa says, shut up and listen. You get graduated, you get a good job, you get money, you buy a car, you have lots of girlfriends, and then you meet Maria, and you get married, and then you have a baby, and you build a house, and one day you come home, and there's Maria in bed with somebody else. What are you going to do, say your time is up? I had this most vividly, I think, overseas. I've done a fair amount of stuff overseas. I remember an interview in Rome with there are 2 wonderful family therapy training places there. 200 trainees each, 10 blocks apart. And one of them was a policeman whose kid was delinquent, I guess. And the problem was mother's sister was very rich. So she ran the family. And this policeman was very highly disrespected in Italy. And they had said several times, the people there, how can you do psychotherapy without getting into politics? I had no idea what they were talking about. But they were talking about communism versus whatever else, socialism. But it didn't make any sense to me that you'd have that. And I said, well, now maybe this is the politics. What about getting Dad a job in the front office? Tell them he's having trouble with his son and he needs a place that's more respectful. Would the police department give him another kind of job? He said, oh my God, if they knew that he was having any trouble with his family, they would fire him tomorrow. We may not ever say anything about that. Different culture. Or I put on a workshop and I made some kind of hand motion, and afterwards they said, God, don't do that. That means your mother is a whore. So you need to be careful to respect your patients as well as your colleague.
There's a question waiting on the other side. Yeah, gentleman in the back.
Yeah, you made a comment earlier in the morning that I was attracted to. You said it's important to be free to belong and to be free to individuate. And I wonder if that freedom, I imagine that freedom is related to your goal in psychotherapy. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, that's again one of the things we'll get at a great deal tomorrow. But if you can't belong, you're not going to get anywhere changing or helping them change. If you can't individuate, they have no alternative except to either capitulate to you or rebel against you. You become then what I call an adoptive parent. You're taking them on and being responsible for them. So individuating is what you need to do to model for them how to individuate. And joining is what you do to help them learn some more about joining and helping them set up an alliance with you, which makes an alliance with their family members a little less frightening and more available, hopefully.
So it's the experience of freedom to be in the dialectic, not
That's right. I'm not sure you could call it freedom. Courageous enough to stay in it, to never try to get out by being captured by the family or get out by going technical and backing away from them. You have to move in and out just like with your own family. Easier professionally, of course, than it is at home.
I'm still unclear about how you see the role of the father, both in the family and in the sense, the co-therapist. I can really see the nurturance, and we also use the word hypnotic, and the mother. I'm not sure I understand what you mean by the genetic role of the father and the powerful but impotent role of the father.
I'm sorry, I may have been, and it's very difficult, but the family did the nicest job of this. They drew the family for me one day. They said, mother is the hub of a wheel. The children are the spokes, and the father is the rim. That's very good. Father is the intermediary between the intimacy of the family circle and the outside world, the ground, the stress. He's the one who's able to say, you either do this job or you don't get your allowance. To put reality into the relationship rather than the intimacy and the closeness and the capacity to expand yourself that the mother offers. Because father's expanse has to be paid for. Mother's comes free. My fantasy. I'll tell you a good example of that. We'll get into some more of this tomorrow. When our kids were growing up, and, one baby after another, I loved to wake up and bottle feed the babies and rock them and cuddle them. And in the middle of the night, if one of the babies was crying, I would hear the cry and get up to give them a bottle. Muriel would have a spasm in her gut. I would never have that kind of physiologic response. I would have a psychological, a psychosocial, if you will. And I think that kind of difference is very profound. I respond, when one of our daughters fell on the ice and got a broken, fractured skull and was bleeding out of her ear. I was a good, powerful, strong man for 3 days, and when she came back to consciousness, I went to pieces. So I'm not meaning that you're not responsive. It's a different kind of response. And in relationship to the children, of course, I think it's a much more clear than it is in the interview.
Question in the back.
I'm wondering about the relationship of the foster parents and what makes for good foster parents and what makes for not so good foster parents.
That's a very nice question, and I ran onto it quite accidentally in some guy in San Francisco who was setting up a foster parent training program. And the more I thought about it, the more exciting it became. If you're the foster mother, if I'm the foster mother, and some 8-year-old boy comes in because his mother has been put in prison or whatever, you say to him, John, the court said you were going to come here and live with us. They didn't ask me, and they didn't ask you. And I hope we can make it. Because I'm not your mother, but I'm going to be a make-believe mother for a while. I don't know how long. The court may call up tomorrow and take you away. And I would be sorry about that, and you might be glad or you might be sorry. But while you stay here, there's some rules. You can't sit in the middle of the living room floor. You can take food out of the refrigerator as long as you don't take so much that we're short for supper. You must realize that I will always love my kids more than I could ever get to love you. You need to know that I like friends, and I hope we can get to have close feelings and enjoy each other. You have all sorts of rights here. You can telephone your mother anytime you want to, or you can telephone the court. You can even run away. Now, if you run away, I have to call the court because I sort of work for them. They pay me for taking care of you, for being your make-believe mother. If you run away, I won't chase you. And if they bring you back, it's probably all right with me. I don't mind your cussing me out. You're not my real child, so it wouldn't be so painful. Up to a point. There'll come a point when I can't take it anymore, and you'll know that. And then it'll be different. Then I'll be angry, and you and I'll have a fight. Don't get in the middle of a fight between my husband and me, because we'll both get you. And I hope your mother is able to take you back soon, because I think a real mother is a lot better than a make-believe. So the therapeutic relationship for a foster parent has become for me very clear and important in setting up the therapeutic relationship. And the pain of being an adoptive therapist who takes on patients for life. And I could tell you stories about that. It'll curl your hair too. 13 years. So I learned all these things from books.
I wanted to ask about working with people for a very brief period of time. Sometimes I have to make decisions just based on the circumstances.
I didn't hear the last part.
I have to make decisions based on the circumstances of what is available to me.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering about, for example, having a family session one time, and whether that in itself can be productive.
Uh-huh. I had a very exciting experience with that. When I went to the medical school, one of the things they asked me to do would be to go up on the ward Tuesday afternoon at 2 and see a family of an inpatient, usually psychotic or so suicide, with their family. And I did that once a week for, I suppose, 15 years. That's a lot of families. I almost never saw them a second time because the law was such and the finances were such that they were supposed to be out in 12 days or something like that, 17 days, and by that time I got more and more free to be invasive in a big way, to be confrontive in a big way, to say, we have 1 hour. The resident has just said to you that Mary tried to commit suicide, and she says it was her boyfriend who deserted her. And I don't believe that. I don't think boyfriends are that important. I think if it's the boyfriend, then it's because the boyfriend is opening up something in the family. I think only people in the family have that much power. And I don't know why or what's going on, but if you guys have the courage to open up your family world, you may be able to save her life. We've got 1 hour to do it. And I moved more and more like that as the years went on and became more and more convinced that the possibilities are almost limitless. And I think you can really do psychotherapy in 5, 10, 15 minutes.
I do a lot seeing people on a one-time basis. But I was also thinking, if I can give an example, I have a family who actually asked me if they could get together with me, which doesn't happen that often, where there are 17 people in the extended family who want to get together over the loss of husband, father, only 5 days ago. And I'm making a decision right now.
Why would you hesitate?
I'm hesitating because I'm afraid of what might happen.
Well, I would.
I think that it's so exciting. I think I'm going to do it because it's so exciting that they want to do it. But I hesitate because the kind of grief reaction that can't possibly be resolved in a short time.
Why do you say that? How do you know? That's like making believe you have a follow-up when you haven't seen the thing. I think you're hesitant because you're afraid of being gobbled up, and I don't blame you.
Yeah.
But I think you ought to answer that in a different way than not seeing them. Get someone else, previous therapist, pastor, someone else that means something to them to be in with you. And that business of being dependent, of being scared, to me is one of the secrets. I'll tell you a crazy one. A priest called me up. He said, I have a very close friend, and my mother, I guess, maybe, I don't know whether mother and father or just mother, asked him if I was homosexual. And I don't know what to do. This is terrible. And I said, well, why don't you get them together and I'll sit down and help you. Oh, no, I wouldn't do that. I want to talk to you. And I said, well, I never talk to people, just to families. And he said, well, what am I going to do? And I said, well, I don't know. Have your mother and father call me if they don't want to meet. And he said, well, I can't do that. And I said, well, good luck. I got called back a week later, and he said, you know, I talked to Mother about it, and she's glad to do it. I said, well, now, how about the boyfriend? He said, oh, he wants to come. I said, well, why don't you bring him? He said, well, I didn't think you'd want him. And I said, I want anybody we can get. He said, well, I have a sister. I said, well, let's get her. He said, well, I also have a brother who lives in Minneapolis. And I said, call him up. I'll make the appointment so that he can get there. He said, well, who else? And I said, I don't know. Who else could there be? He said, well, how about our family priest? He's been our priest for 25 years. I said, why didn't you bring him up before? Of course. We met 10 to 12 in the morning and 2 to 4 in the afternoon because the brother was coming in from way away. The priest talked a fair amount about how much he enjoyed his family and had known him over the years and so forth. Chit-chat. Nothing happened. We broke at 12, came back at 2. At 5 minutes of 4, he said to his mother, what would you say if I said I was homosexual? She said, well, you would still be my son. That's all that ever happened. I think it was good therapy. I was essentially just a mother. You know. But the father part was setting it up. You see, the administrative business of forcing everybody I could get, including somebody for me. You know? Now, this was after I'd retired, so I didn't have a resident. Otherwise, I'd have had a resident too. But the previous therapist, I think any time you can't get the previous therapist, then you're making the same kind of mistake that step-parents do who don't have the previous spouses in, or the biological parents. I think you leave a hole in everybody's fantasy rather than making it an interpersonal project. But I'd do it 15 minutes, 10 minutes. I don't think, that may be going too far. I'm not sure I ever know that therapy has been damaging. I've had funny ones. Like we had a physician outside of Madison, 20 miles, who for 10 years had had recurrent manic attacks. And when he had a manic attack, he'd get all his appendicitis cases together for a big beer party, or something else of typical manic style. And then he'd end up in the VA hospital, and they'd keep him in there for several months. And one year he made the mistake of coming into the university hospital, and then I forced the family therapy thing, 6 kids and mother. And we had I thought, a good interview. The next week they came back. Mother was paranoid, crazy as hell. So they knew it better than to come back again. I invited them back, but they didn't come, and he's, I'm supposed, been going on having manic attacks. The coordinate problem of keeping Mother from being schizophrenic, or keeping her schizophrenia hidden. So sometimes I think it's painful, like that one. I don't think that was dangerous. I don't think it, to me at least, it has not been dangerous. Clear about individual therapy can be dangerous. I'm very clear about that. Lots of examples, including death.
I was trying to put together the idea of therapist as a nurturer, but with also not pulling the client into being dependent on that so that they don't learn how to nurture themselves.
I think that has to do with us. I think you have to model for them. And this is very difficult to learn because we're really sick. You have to learn how to desert them. You have to learn how, like this foster mother, saying, look, you cannot shit in the middle of the floor. You better not get in a fight between me and my husband. She was separating her role and her personhood, her role and her real world. And I think you need to do that. The trick, I said this morning, and I'm not at all sure it isn't a good one, to get up in the middle of the first interview and walk out. And come back 5 minutes later and say, no, I don't know what I just went out. So they get a sense that you're not just their victim. You're not just their God-given gift. You're also a person. And then you can be a person whenever you want to. And one of the things we can talk about tomorrow is how to do that during the interview. Like I have a whole series of puzzles that I play with. Or Nerf ball frisbees. You ever see a Nerf ball frisbee? The most wonderful toy in the world. You can't do anything damaging with it, but it's very diverting. And she keeps people from double thinking. Instead of Mother thinking, I wonder what he meant by that statement. Does he think I'm so-and-so? What does my husband think about what he said about me? All that stuff is diverted if you have a diversion of your own. If you have a way of not being anxious about their anxiety. Because if they're anxious about having a delinquent kid and you're anxious about their anxiety, then they add another burden. My God, we're worrying a therapist. The poor guys, So they need to know that you're free. They need to know that you can move out, that you're not to blame for them, either ideologically or curatively. And I'll more about that, a lot more about that tomorrow. Another question, and I want to get into my last blurb.
Over here, I was thinking about your example where you worked with families for 1 hour and you never saw them again, and you were giving the example of the girl who attempted suicide. And if I put myself in your shoes and think of setting up the situation that way, I would have my emotional reaction was, I am now taking responsibility for this family. And I'm wondering how you dealt with it in those situations.
When I see you're saying that you take responsibility for the family, I was taking responsibility for the hour. Like I think you could take responsibility for 15 minutes. I had a wonderful experience. I had a social worker, professional family therapist, or I don't know, social worker anyway, from San Francisco who moved to Madison and said, I've had a good therapist, and then I had a lousy marriage. She'd gotten into therapy to get away from her mother, and she got married to get away from her therapist. And then she left the marriage to come to Madison where she had a job, and her therapist had said, you should see Whitaker. I know him there. She came into me, told me this story. I said, you know, it sounds like you've had a good therapeutic experience. I don't think you can get everything in life out of dyadic relationships. You've got a good chance now. Why don't you work, get an apartment, no TV, no radio, no reading, no friends. You come home and stay with yourself in the dark, in isolation. When the anxiety gets too great, you come over and knock on my door. I'll leave the family I'm seeing and come out and pat you on the head, and then you can go on back. We did that for 4 months. She played Christ's 40 Days in the Desert, Finding Yourself. And she came in, I think, 3 or 4 times, and we did just what I said. I'd come out and say, how's it going? She'd say, oh, I'm scared to death. I said, well, it's all right, don't worry, it'll go away. And she would leave. And I saw her 5 years later when I went to do a workshop in San Francisco. She had remarried, she was working, and still struggling hard to find herself, because psychotherapy doesn't solve the world, you know, it starts you going. But I think you take responsibility for your competence and for your effort and for the time within the practicalities. And you never know what's going to happen. When I left Atlanta, I left 65 patients. I said goodbye to all of them twice at three-month intervals. Oh, in the course of that time, I had 4 more applicants from the schizzy people. I said to the faculty, to the group of us, what am I going to do? You know, I don't want to just refer them to you guys until I'm gone, but should I just postpone it and tell them I'm going to be gone in 3 months? And somebody said, well, why don't you see them and tell them how to get as much as possible out of therapy? Teach them. Well, that was a good idea. So I told them what was happening. I was leaving in 3 months, and if they wanted to, I would spend those 3 months trying to teach them how to be good patients to whoever they saw afterwards. And I wouldn't refer them to anybody, because I don't believe in that. So I did. It was interesting business. 3 years later, I saw one of them in a national conference. I said, hey, how's it going? He said, fine. I said, I'm in training. I'm be finishing my therapy training in a few months. I said, well, how to go with your therapist? Oh, he said, I never did go for therapy. And I don't know what that means. My guess is that this relationship, which I had structured artificially, may have been just as useful as my having gone on in full-fledged effort. Wouldn't it be nice if we knew the answers? I've had so many things like that happen. It's very humbling. People are so much more wonderful than we are. I wasn't talking about me, of course. Okay, shall I give you this last? This is where this all started. The definition of a healthy family. And these are mine. They came to me in this kind of a burst many years ago. I've gone through them time and time again. I have no idea whether it's just my delusion that makes them still solid, but I give them to you for your own thought and because it's as close as I've gotten. The first thing in a healthy family is what I've come to call family nationalism. I don't know your culture well enough. The Kennedy family is the one I think about. You know, it's a unitary set. The fact that Grandma is trying to get the 4th one killed off or the 3rd one, it's something else. But the family unit is very clear. You know, And she may make it yet. Yeah, she. So the family nationalism is a belief in the unitary fact of the family, independent of the 3 generations or 4 generations or the in-laws. And I'm not sure it has to do with the name, you know. I think the mother's family may be as powerful as the father's, and I'm just using it in a general sense. The second one is the one that Mnuchin is so famous for, in my book at least, the generation gap. In the States, we had a fairly extended period when we were making believe that the family was a democratic set of states, and all. When our 6 kids all voted against the 2 of us, you know, we were in trouble. And we just decided we had more rights. We had separate rights. And that generation gap, I think, is very critical. And it can happen all sorts of ways. You know, the parents can make believe they're children, and the children can parentify the parents. I remember one 12-year-old I saw whose mother and father gave him their salaries, and he gave them their allowance. He did the grocery shopping. That's a parentified child, a very, very standard. By the way, the cure for that's equally standard. You up the anxiety level. You say to this 12-year-old, you know, I think you ought to get an accountant to help you with this, so that you're not going to leave them without enough money for their burial. And not only that, you should get someone else to consult with you about whether you're raising their allowance or lowering it would be helpful to them. You build the pathology to the place where it's beyond their clinical tolerance. Like you say to the kid who's cooking the supper for mother who comes home, you know, I think more than that, you should rub her neck each time when she comes home, and in the morning before she goes off to work, because work is very difficult. You've converted an evolving pathology into a role. And once you've done that, the role can become uncomfortable, and then they drop the whole role. And you're back to a set of different character than the parentified child and the infantilized mother or father or both. So the second one is the generation gap. The parents need to know they belong to one generation and the children belong to another, and the children need to know that too. And many times that same thing is true, again, I hadn't thought of this before, between the second and third generation. You know, the mother and father need to be clear that the grandfather and grandmother belong to another generation.